At 8:14 a.m. local time, the Caribbean Sea seemed almost too calm. The surface was smooth, sunlight shimmered across the water, and visibility stretched for miles. From a distance, it looked like an ordinary morning at sea. No rough weather, no major traffic nearby, and nothing that hinted at a problem. But inside the operations center of a U.S. Navy destroyer conducting lawful movement through international waters, the mood changed instantly. A new surface contact appeared on radar, then another, then three more. Within seconds, 5 separate tracks were glowing on the display. They were small naval vessels, low in the water, moving quickly. At first, their heading stayed steady, running roughly parallel to the American ship's course. That alone was not unusual. Venezuelan patrol vessels had followed U.S. ships before. Professional navies monitor one another. It happens. But then, at 8:17, everything changed. All 5 contacts adjusted course at the same time. Not slowly, not by chance. Together. Their new headings angled inward, gradually narrowing the space around the U.S. destroyer. Their speed began to rise, moving from a routine patrol pace to something far more intentional. 20 knots, then 23. The closest point of approach began shrinking quickly. On the bridge, the officer of the deck stayed calm. Logged the course change. Maintain speed. Maintain ROE. The rules of engagement were clear. The U.S. vessel was not inside Venezuelan territorial waters. There was no legal reason for the situation to intensify, but staying calm did not mean ignoring what was happening. Every movement, every signal, every degree of turn was being recorded. A bridge-to-bridge message was sent. This is a United States Navy vessel conducting lawful transit in international waters. You are closing distance at high speed. State your intentions. No answer. The message was repeated in Spanish. Still nothing. By 8:20, the radar display was telling the story better than any response could. The Venezuelan vessels were no longer simply following, they were taking positions. 2 moved slightly ahead of the American ship's bow. 1 stayed back on the port side, another widened out to starboard. The 5th remained directly astern. It was not a complete enclosure, it was more careful than that. A loose box, a formation designed to apply pressure without crossing the most obvious line. Inside the operations center, tracking teams updated vectors while electronic specialists monitored the surrounding signals. So far, there was no direct cueing of advanced systems, no sudden escalation, no visible sign that the situation had reached its most serious level. But intent is not always announced loudly. Sometimes it is shown through numbers, angles, speed, distance, and how quickly the space between vessels disappears. At 8:22, one Venezuelan vessel accelerated again, moving beyond normal patrol speed. Its bow wake sharpened. Infrared sensors picked up increased exhaust heat. This was not drifting. This was commitment. The American destroyer did not alter course. That decision mattered. In encounters like this, the first vessel to turn can lose control of the story. A change in course can later be described as avoidance, retreat, or a response to pressure. The U.S. Navy understood that clearly. Presence was the message. Not provocation, not panic, just presence. Quietly, the ship's posture shifted. Long-range optical systems zoomed in, capturing hull numbers, deck activity, and crew movement in sharp detail. Every frame was time-stamped. Every second was preserved. Below deck, the electronic monitoring suite began cataloging faint signals. Routine surface search sweeps, low power, but deliberate. Someone in the watch team said it quietly. They're painting us. Not locking, not openly threatening, but watching closely and making sure the Americans knew it. By 8:24, the nearest Venezuelan vessel was inside 5 nautical miles and still closing. Crew members could be seen near its forward mount. No one had taken the next step, but helmets were on and the movements looked organized. This was not confusion. This was not a navigational mistake. And still, the U.S. ship continued forward. No dramatic alarms, no loud announcements, no sudden maneuvers, just controlled silence, precise tracking, and disciplined documentation. Because this is how modern naval standoffs are often decided. Not by whoever makes the first move, but by whoever forces the other side to reveal their intent while staying completely under control. At 8:26, as the distance tightened and the formation compressed, one final internal note appeared on the destroyer's status board. Intent trending assertive. That was the moment the situation moved from simple observation into measured response. Venezuela appeared to believe that 5 vessels were enough to create pressure. They were about to see what controlled escalation really looked like. By 8:27 a.m., coincidence was no longer a believable explanation. On the radar screen, the pattern no longer looked like routine shadowing or parallel movement. The 5 Venezuelan vessels had settled into a posture that experienced naval officers would recognize immediately. Not a direct engagement formation, but something uncomfortably close to it. close enough to create pressure, but loose enough to explain it away later. This was classic gray zone maneuvering. The nearest vessel, now less than 4 nautical miles from the U.S. destroyer's starboard bow, adjusted its course again. Only a few degrees, but enough to tighten the approach. Another vessel mirrored the movement from port. The one astern edged closer as well, carefully holding its spacing, making sure the American ship could not slow down without looking as if it had given ground. Inside the operations center, voices stayed quiet and controlled. CPA now 3.2 miles. Speed 25 knots and increasing. Formation is coordinated. That final word carried weight. Coordinated meant command and control. It meant this was not one captain making an independent choice. Someone else, either ashore or on another platform, was almost certainly watching the situation unfold in real time. The U.S. destroyer sent another bridge-to-bridge message. This is a United States Navy vessel. You are conducting unsafe maneuvers. Alter course immediately. Again, no response. Then, at 8:29, something new appeared on the electronic monitoring console. A narrow radar sweep. Low power, surface search mode, but clearly intentional. They're active, the electronic warfare officer said. Surface search. They're tracking us. It was not the most serious kind of targeting signal. That line had not been crossed. But turning on radar while closing distance still sent a clear message without a single word. We see you, and we want you to know it. On the bridge, the captain studied the feed without showing emotion. The rules of engagement were still being followed. No systems had been openly directed at the other side, and no final threshold had been crossed. But the point for a measured response had arrived. Show presence, he said. Nothing more. The order moved quietly through the ship. Long-range cameras tightened their focus, capturing clean images of deck crews, mast setups, and forward mounts on the Venezuelan vessels. Every movement was documented. Every angle was preserved. Below deck, the destroyer's main deck system shifted slightly, just enough to be visible through optics, but not enough to look like a direct aim. It was a signal, not a provocation. At 8:31, the Venezuelan formation compressed again. One vessel pushed forward, its bow cutting sharply through the water. Its wake made the message obvious. The engines were working far beyond a normal patrol setting. This was no longer just symbolic closeness. This was calculated pressure. And still, the American destroyer did not change course. Speed held. Course held. Silence held. That restraint was deliberate. In encounters like this, escalation does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it is quiet, professional, and carefully designed to make the other side choose between stepping back or crossing a line they cannot easily reverse. At 8:33, deck observers reported visible movement on one of the Venezuelan ships near its forward mount. Personnel were taking positions nearby. They were not fully operating it, but they were clearly standing ready. Inside the operations center, the assessment changed again. Intent confirmed. Pressure maneuver ongoing. The captain gave a single nod. Launch the helo. The order was not emotional. It was procedural. Within minutes, the MH-60 Seahawk's rotors came alive. The aircraft lifted smoothly from the deck and banked low over the water. No dramatic moves, no aggressive display. Just a controlled climb to 200 feet, placing itself between the American destroyer and the closest Venezuelan vessel. The helicopter's sensors came online at once. High-definition optical cameras, infrared tracking, precision observation systems, non-escalatory but impossible to miss. From the Seahawk's nose camera, the Venezuelan vessel filled the frame. Heat signatures from its engines glowed bright. Crew members were clearly visible on deck. The image was sharp enough to read their body language. Tense, alert, and fully aware they were now the focus of attention. Then came the transmission. Venezuelan naval vessel. This is a United States Navy helicopter. You are operating unsafely in international waters. Alter course immediately. Your actions are being recorded. The message was delivered calmly, then repeated in Spanish. For the first time since the encounter began, the Venezuelan vessels hesitated. It was subtle, almost invisible to the naked eye. But on radar, it was clear. Speed dropped by 2 knots. The forward vessel's bow shifted by barely a degree, but it moved away from the closing geometry. They had not fully stepped back yet. But the pressure had changed direction, because now the encounter was no longer 5 ships against 1. It was no longer 5 vessels facing 1 ship. It was 5 vessels facing an entire system. A system that recorded every move, responded with precision, increased pressure only in measured steps, and never lost control of the situation. Now, the next choice belonged to Venezuela. By 8:35 a.m., the encounter had reached its most sensitive stage. The U.S. Navy Seahawk remained steady at 200 feet, its rotors cutting through the humid Caribbean air as it moved in a controlled orbit above the water. From that height, the pattern below was impossible to miss. 5 Venezuelan naval vessels were no longer moving in a casual line. They had formed a tightening shape around the American destroyer. It was not an open confrontation posture, but it was close enough for every captain involved to understand how quickly one wrong move could change everything. Inside the helicopter, the sensor operator moved from vessel to vessel. Hull numbers were recorded. Crew positions were noted. Forward deck equipment was still not being actively operated, but personnel were close enough to show readiness. Engine heat signatures confirmed that the Venezuelan ships were still running at high output. They were not drifting. They were waiting. Back on the destroyer, the bridge stayed calm. No alarms, no shouting, just information. The helicopter's live video feed streamed directly into the operations center, layered over radar tracks and electronic readings. This was no longer just a visual standoff. It was a fully documented naval encounter, unfolding second by second. At 8:37, the Seahawk adjusted its orbit slightly. It moved closer to the lead Venezuelan vessel, still within safe limits, but close enough to make the message unmistakable. A precision marking system briefly illuminated the vessel's bridge windows with a soft green glow. It was non-destructive, controlled, and impossible to ignore. The radio message followed immediately. Venezuelan naval vessel, you are approaching a United States Navy ship at an unsafe distance. Alter course now. This interaction is being recorded for international review. The message was then repeated in Spanish. For several seconds, nothing changed. Then the radar display showed the first shift. The lead Venezuelan vessel slowed from 25 knots to 22. Its wake became shorter. Its bow, which had been pointed toward a tightening intercept path, eased slightly off angle. It was not a full withdrawal, not yet, but it was no longer a direct challenge. Inside the operations center, the watch supervisor marked the update. Contact 1 decelerating. Heading adjusting. The Seahawk held position. Sensors stayed fixed. Cameras did not look away. This was the kind of moment trained naval crews understand immediately. Pull back too early and the other side may press forward again. Push too hard and the situation can become harder to control. The U.S. response remained carefully balanced. At 8:39, the helicopter shifted attention to the second Venezuelan vessel, the one positioned wide on the port side. The camera zoomed in. Movement on deck slowed. One sailor raised binoculars toward the aircraft. Another stepped away from the forward deck position. Then came the second adjustment. That vessel reduced speed as well. Across the formation, the change began to spread. One by one, the Venezuelan vessels made small corrections. Nothing dramatic, nothing they could not later describe as routine navigation. But the pattern was obvious. The loose box around the American destroyer was opening. No one celebrated. This was not about winning a scene. It was about control. At 8:41, the Seahawk widened its orbit, now circling both the lead vessel and the one on the port side. Its presence remained constant. Its cameras kept recording. Every radar sweep from the Venezuelan vessels was logged. Every course change was time-stamped. Every pause was preserved. That was the real strength of the U.S. Navy in this moment. Not volume, not drama, discipline. One Venezuelan ship appeared to attempt a face-saving move, briefly increasing speed by a single knot before settling again. The helicopter did not react. No new warning, no sharp maneuver, no visible change in posture, just steady observation. And somehow that silence carried more weight than any loud statement could have. At 8:43, the Venezuelan vessel at the rear, the last one still maintaining pressure, finally broke from its position. It drifted back, increasing its distance to more than 6 nautical miles. The surrounding shape was gone. Moments later, a radio transmission came through for the first time. United States naval vessel, we are conducting sovereign patrol operations in proximity to Venezuelan waters. The wording was careful, political, defensive, built for later explanation. The American reply was immediate and calm. This is a United States Navy ship conducting lawful transit in international waters. Your unsafe maneuvers have been recorded. Maintain safe distance. No argument, no debate, no change in course. By 8:45, the Seahawk climbed slightly, pulling back to a higher observation altitude, while keeping all 5 Venezuelan vessels within sensor range. Below, the destroyer continued along its original heading, steady and unbothered. The message was now impossible to miss. The U.S. Navy had not used force. It had not changed course. It had not raised the temperature of the encounter. And still, 5 Venezuelan naval vessels had quietly adjusted their movements, step by step, and every moment of it had been recorded. The standoff was no longer about pressure. It was about who had just lost control of the story. By 8:47 a.m., the tension had clearly shifted. Only minutes earlier, the 5 Venezuelan vessels had appeared to be carrying out a coordinated pressure maneuver. Now, that formation was coming apart in real time. On the radar display aboard the U.S. Navy destroyer, the tight pattern began to loosen contact by contact. Distances widened, headings shifted. The carefully formed loose box around the American ship slowly faded away. No alarm sounded, no announcement was made. The movement said enough. The Seahawk helicopter remained above the scene, steady and watchful, but no longer pressing close. From its higher orbit, its sensors captured the changing situation with sharp precision. The lead Venezuelan vessel, which had been the most assertive moments earlier, reduced speed again, dropping from 22 knots to 19. Its bow shifted another degree outward, opening a wider path of clear water ahead of the U.S. destroyer. Then the second vessel adjusted, then the third. Each movement was small enough to explain later as routine navigation. But taken together, the pattern was unmistakable. The pressure had broken. Inside the operations center, the watch team followed the changes in silence. Contact 1 opening distance. Contact 2 matching speed. Contact 3 drifting astern. The captain watched the display without comment. This was the outcome professional naval crews try to achieve in moments like this. Not domination, not drama, but control without escalation. At 8:49, the Venezuelan vessels began shifting into a loose trailing line behind the U.S. destroyer. It was a familiar posture, one used to maintain visibility without creating direct tension. They were still present, but now they were shadowing, not challenging. The American ship gave no visible response, no speed change, no turn, no acknowledgement. From the Seahawk's cockpit, the sensor operators zoomed in on the nearest Venezuelan vessel. Crew members who had earlier stood ready near the forward deck position were now stepping back. Helmets came off. One sailor briefly raised an arm toward the helicopter. It was not hostile. It was not surrender. It was simply human. The helicopter remained steady and continued recording. At 8:51, a final radio message came from the Venezuelan formation. United States naval vessel, we will maintain safe distance during our patrol. It was the closest thing to a concession they were likely to give. The American reply was brief. Maintain safe distance. Continue safe navigation. Nothing more. The Seahawk widened its orbit again, climbing to 500 feet as the situation stabilized. Its sensors stayed focused, but the tone of the encounter had clearly changed. What had begun as a calculated pressure play had ended as a documented withdrawal. By 8:54, all 5 Venezuelan vessels were more than 6 nautical miles away, maintaining parallel courses safely clear of any closing path. The U.S. destroyer continued forward without interruption, its wake cutting a clean line through open water. There were no celebrations on the bridge, no applause in the operations center, because this was never about winning a dramatic moment. It was about owning the record. Every maneuver, every speed change, every unanswered message had been archived, time-stamped, geolocated, and preserved. In modern naval encounters, what happens afterward can matter just as much as what happens at sea. Video, radar logs, and radio transcripts can travel farther than any ship. They can shape diplomatic discussions, guide command decisions, and define the story long after the vessels have disappeared over the horizon. Venezuela would later be able to describe the event as a routine patrol interaction. The United States would not need to argue loudly. The evidence already told the story. By 8:57, the Seahawk received clearance to return. It turned smoothly toward the destroyer's flight deck, banking away from the Venezuelan formation. Below, the Venezuelan vessels remained visible on the horizon, still present, still watching, but no longer setting the terms. As the helicopter touched down, the deck crew secured it with practiced calm. The encounter was over, not with force, not with heated language, but with restraint, documentation, and an unbroken course. 5 Venezuelan naval vessels had approached a U.S. Navy destroyer, believing pressure alone might force a reaction. Instead, they had been recorded, outmaneuvered, and quietly pushed back without the situation crossing the line. And in the Caribbean that morning, that was the only result that mattered. By 9:02 a.m., the sea looked calm again, almost as if nothing had happened. But aboard the destroyer, every second of the encounter remained preserved. Every heading, every signal, every movement, every silence. The water had returned to normal, the record had not. On the surface, everything looked normal again. The U.S. Navy destroyer continued along its original heading, engines steady, sensors active, and the crew returning to routine watch rotations. Far behind it, 5 Venezuelan naval vessels remained at a cautious distance. They were still visible on radar, but they no longer affected the ship's navigation, its mission, or its course. The encounter at sea had ended, but the consequences were only beginning. Below deck, analysts started building the full record. Radar tracks were synced with optical footage. Radio transmissions were matched with exact timestamps. Course changes, speed shifts, and sensor activity were reconstructed minute by minute. This was not theater. This was evidence. In modern naval operations, this stage can matter even more than the encounter itself, because the real contest does not always happen on the water. Sometimes it happens afterward, in the review room, in the official report, in the diplomatic message, and in the command decision that shapes what happens the next time two vessels meet at sea. From a strategic point of view, the Venezuelan maneuver had failed at every level. If the goal was to intimidate, it did not work. If the goal was to force the American ship to change course, that did not happen. If the goal was to create a public messaging moment, the result went the other way. 5 vessels tried to apply pressure. One destroyer absorbed that pressure without changing direction. That imbalance was the lesson. Venezuela's Navy understands that it cannot match the United States ship for ship. So its approach depends on friction, close movements, unclear intentions, careful positioning, and moments designed to test the other side's reaction. These are gray zone tactics meant to stay just below the line of open confrontation. But gray zone tactics only work when the other side loses discipline. That never happened. The U.S. Navy response followed a playbook shaped by decades of similar encounters, from crowded sea lanes to contested waters around the world. The pattern is simple, but difficult to execute under pressure. Establish presence, record everything, respond step by step, never lose control of the story. No sudden turns, no emotional decisions, no dramatic display, just steady movement, calm communication, and relentless documentation. That restraint was not weakness, it was control. Because restraint forces the other side to make every choice visible. Every acceleration, every pause, every adjustment, every quiet step back. And once those choices are recorded, they become difficult to deny later. Somewhere ashore, Venezuelan commanders would likely review footage from their own vessels and compare it to what they knew the Americans had captured. They would see the same pattern the U.S. Navy saw, a maneuver that began with confidence and ended quietly. No dramatic outcome, no public victory, just disengagement. For the sailors aboard the American destroyer, it became another logged encounter, another reminder that most modern naval confrontations never become major headlines, precisely because they are handled correctly. No dramatic footage means no viral moment. No open incident means no breaking news cycle. But that does not make these moments unimportant. They shape the future. They establish expectations. They define boundaries. They deliver lessons without turning the situation into something larger. The message sent that morning was clear. Pressure alone will not move a U.S. Navy ship operating lawfully in international waters. Presence will be met with presence. Pressure will be met with discipline. And every move will be recorded. That lesson reaches far beyond the Caribbean. The same playbook applies anywhere rival navies test one another, from narrow straits to crowded shipping lanes, where small decisions can carry enormous weight. The side that stays calm, predictable, and professional usually holds the advantage over time. As the destroyer continued through open water, its wake stretched clean and unbroken behind it. The 5 Venezuelan vessels faded into the background, still there, still watching, but no longer shaping the situation. That is how modern naval power is often exercised, not through force, but through restraint so steady that the other side runs out of room to maneuver. So the real question is this. In an era where one wrong move at sea can create a much larger crisis, is disciplined restraint the smartest tool a navy can use? Or does calm professionalism invite the next test? Share your thoughts below. Because out on the open sea, the most important confrontations are often the ones that end without a sound.